The wind that morning carried dust and whispers across the cracked plains, a sweeping breath of the desert that had seen centuries of warriors, cattle drives, caravans of hopeful settlers, and the graves of the forgotten, and it rolled like a living beast through the skeleton grasses, surrounding the small, frontier outpost of Coyote Bend, where a trading post, a half-collapsed blacksmith shed, and a saloon with peeling paint named the Copper Lantern stood as the last bastion of civilization. Before the Apache territories, it was there a lone rancher named Cole Enders tied his horse, wiped the dust from his eyes, and attempted to negotiate a debt that had begun to choke the very air from his lungs and dreams, because the previous winter had killed half his cattle and the spring had been crueler still, burning his crops into brittle stalks beneath a merciless sun, leaving him with nothing to sell except his backbreaking labor and the faint hope someone might pity his misfortune, which was unlikely, because in Coyote Bend pity was a currency no one could afford. He entered the office of the trader, Beckett Shaw, a man whose thin lips curved like a predator's smile and whose eyes weighed every soul as though they were cattle on a scale. And Cole stood before him with his hat in his hands, saying, "Beckett, I owe you, I know I do, but that doesn't mean I can give you what you're asking." To which Beckett leaned back in his chair, flicked ash from his cigar, and replied, "You've had months, Enders. Your tab is taller than a church steeple and thicker than a Bible, and I'm not in the business of charity. Either you pay or I take what I've been offered." And Cole blinked, confused because he had offered nothing until he heard the shuffling noise behind Beckett's desk, and then saw her, a young Apache girl, no more than 17, trembling with her hands bound in front of her, her coal dark hair falling like a shadow down her shoulders, her frightened eyes lifting to meet Cole's, wide and silent like the eyes of a doe who had not yet understood the shot was meant for her. Cole's stomach sank like a stone in a pond, and he whispered, "What is this?" Beckett grinned wider, pointing to her as if she were merchandise. "She's the repayment the tribe offered her for your debt. Seems they think you'll make a good husband or protector or some such nonsense, and they know I do business with you. So either you take her and your debt is cleared, or I sell her to a buyer who doesn't ask questions." And Cole backed away, revolted, every drop of blood in his body burning with shame, because the girl was barely a woman, and not his to claim like a mule or a saddle. And he raised his voice, "I won't take her. I won't own her. That isn't payment. That's slavery." And Beckett chuckled through smoke. "Call it whatever you like, cowboy. The world doesn't care for your delicate feelings. Debts get paid one way or another." And before Cole could spit another word, the door swung open with a violent crash, the kind of sound that made the room recoil, and there stood a second woman, tall and fierce, a hurricane shaped into flesh, dressed in black mourning cloth, her hair braided with bone and amber, her face streaked with cedar paint, her eyes blazing with stormfire. Everyone in the room froze, even Beckett, because this woman was not a girl. She was a widow, a mother, a fighter, one of those Apache women who carried centuries of battle scars in her bloodline. She strode forward without hesitation and stood between the girl and the men, and when she spoke, her voice was the thunder of mountains shaking loose from the earth. "Don't take my sister, take me. I'd make a better wife. I'm experienced." And Cole's jaw fell, because the desperation in her words was not shame, it was sacrifice, the kind of sacrifice only someone who had watched her world die would dare make. Beckett, always the opportunist, narrowed his eyes, studying her like a wolf studies a buck trapped in brush, and he smirked. "Experienced, are you? That's a fine selling point." And she turned to face him, chin lifted. "I know men. I know work. I know what it means to keep a home standing when there is nothing but wind and death around it. I am not a child who will shiver in a stranger's bed." And the girl behind her whimpered, tugging at her bonds, but the widow pressed a hand against her shoulder and stilled her trembling, the gesture firm and protective. Cole, still frozen, forced words through his throat. "No one is taking anyone, it's wrong." But the widow cut him off with a cold stare that pierced through his conscience like a spear. "Wrong is when your children starve. Wrong is when men raid your village, and the war drums stop because there are no warriors left to beat them. Wrong is when we bury our husbands and watch the sky turn its back on us. What you call wrong is simply a world that has teeth and Cole staggered under the weight of her truth, because he had seen that world too, seen hungry bones, broken promises, bullet-ridden graves, and he knew she was not speaking metaphor. Beckett rose from his chair, intrigued, rubbing his jaw with the back of his hand. You want to take her place, fine. The debt is big, you'll pay it with your life, your obedience, and your body if the man demands it. And he gestured to Cole. He's the buyer. It's his choice, and Cole felt as though he had been dragged underwater, choking on moral mud and judgment, because he was being made the villain in a play he had not auditioned for. And he shook his head violently. I don't want a wife, I don't want anyone. I came here to settle accounts, not barge into someone's family. But the widow stepped closer, her breath steady, her words heavy as iron. Then accept me and set my sister free. And silence lay like ash over the room. Outside the wind howled, rattling the saloon signs and buckboard wheels, as if the desert itself waited for Cole to speak. He swallowed, his conscience wrestling with the cold brutality of the frontier, and he finally muttered, I can't, not like this, and she bristled with fury. Coward, she hissed. You'd rather let him sell her than accept a woman who knows the cost of blood. And Cole reeled back, because no Apache woman had ever called him that, and in her eyes he saw not hatred but a test, as though she were measuring the soul of the man who stood in front of her. Beckett laughed, clapping his hands once. Enough sentiment. Enters, you choose now, take the girl or the widow, or I sell them both, and your debt remains. And the moment exploded with chaos. The girl cried out, the widow lunged. Beckett reached for the revolver hanging by his desk. Cole threw himself between them, and in an instant the room turned to a cloud of dust and violence. The widow shoved her sister toward the door, shouting in Apache, run, and the girl fled like a startled hawk, bursting into sunlight, sprinting down the road where horses snorted and townsfolk gasped. Beckett cursed, drawing steel, and Cole reacted by instinct, grappling his arm, the pistol firing into the ceiling, splinters raining down like hail. The widow seized a poker from the hearth and swung it with terrifying skill, striking Beckett's wrist, the gun clattering to the floor. Cole lunged to retrieve it, but she pinned it under her heel, eyes burning into his, daring him to challenge her. And the world held its breath, because in that moment she was not bargaining anymore, she was declaring war on fate itself. And the rancher who had arrived to beg for mercy found himself staring at a woman who would rather shatter her own chains than watch another child be ground beneath the gears of men like Beckett. Soldiers from the street heard the shot and stormed in, rifles raised, faces white with panic. But the widow did not move, did not blink, did not cower. She stood in the center of chaos and said to Cole in a voice that sounded like a prayer and a threat, you may not want a wife, but the desert will teach you that some women are not taken. Some women choose who is worthy of their loyalty. And as the soldiers dragged Beckett away screaming, as the girl disappeared into the horizon like a ghost freed from captivity, and as the dust settled on the broken floorboards of that trading post, Cole realized that this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a fire that could scorch the entire frontier. The sheriff's office smelled of sweat, stale coffee, and burnt wood, the kind of scent that clung to every frontier lawman who spent more time calming drunk cowboys than preventing real crimes. And Cole sat in a wooden chair across from Sheriff Avery Holden, a man who had lived long enough to see the West Bend from tribal lands to mining towns, and had learned that justice was usually just the prettiest lie in the room. He rubbed his eyes as Holden paced, muttering curses, because the incident at Beckett's post had already spread like wildfire, and every drunk at the Copper Lantern was now telling the story as though they had been inside the room, taking turns embellishing details. And Holden said, you're telling me a widow just walked in and took a poker to Beckett Shaw? Beckett, the same Beckett who once shot a miner in the leg for being 3 hours late with a debt payment? And Cole nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. She didn't just attack, she stopped him from selling her sister. And Holden leaned against the barred window, tapping his hat's brim. Selling? Of course he was. Half the traders in this town are knee-deep in the flesh market. They call it labor contracts, indenture agreements, good Christian sponsorship, but it's worth more to the saloon rats to sell people than to sell flour. And he turned, eyes weary. The army says the Apache are hostile. The traders say they're savage, but I've yet to see an Apache try to cage a white man, while Beckett and his kind cage them like wolves. It's madness, and Cole exhaled, because Holden was one of the few men in Coyote Bend who still held a piece of his humanity unbroken. But even he could not change the tides sweeping across the territory. Outside the window, morning dust kicked up beneath wagons, horses, and the occasional rifle-bearing soldier, while shopkeepers shouted over the noise, and Cole felt the weight of the widows, words pressed against his skull, like a branding iron. Some women are not taken. Some choose who is worthy of their loyalty, and the line would not leave him. Echoing from somewhere deeper than reason, Holden sat at his desk, lighting a cheap cigar, then said, "Tell me her name," and Cole blinked. Embarrassed, "I don't know. She never gave it," and Holden grunted. Unimpressed, "You broke a trade post, disarmed a local tyrant, almost got shot, and you don't even know the woman's name," and Cole muttered, "I didn't break anything." "She did," and Holden replied, "and you stopped her from being gunned down. So congratulations. You're both in trouble now." And that was the moment the office door swung open and the widow herself stepped inside, like a gust of wind that refused to knock, her presence filling the room with the same fierce gravity that had silenced Beckett Shaw, and she said, "My name is Naeli," her voice steady as the sandstone cliffs west of the rivers, and the sheriff straightened from his cigar, eyebrows raised, because Apache rarely gave their names to white officers. She walked forward, ignoring the deputies who tensed at their desks, and said to Cole, "You left my sister alone in this town," and Cole blinked. Surprised, "I didn't." She ran, but Naeli's eyes hardened. "She ran because I told her to run. You let her escape, but you didn't protect her path," and Holden interjected, "Easy, we've got soldiers combing the town for a girl who matches your sister's description. They saw her crying near the old well. Then she vanished, likely out toward the ridge," and Naeli's shoulders tightened, fear crackling beneath her stoic exterior, but she masked it with a warrior's iron. "She will be hunted if she is found. Your people consider unclaimed women property," and Holden grumbled, "Not my people," and Naeli snapped, "You wear their badge," and silence fell like a dropped stone in a quiet pond. The sheriff reached for his hat, placed it on the table, and countered, "I wear this badge so the wrong men don't get to wear it," and that answer, humble and cold, settled the tension. Naeli did not apologize, she merely shifted her stance, chin-dipping in acknowledgement of a truth she could respect. Then she turned to Cole. "You said you would not take me," and Cole nodded miserably. "I still won't," and she approached him so close he could smell the faint cedar in her braids and the dust of the desert clinging to her skin, eyes dark as summer thunderclouds, and she whispered, "Then you must decide. Do you condemn us both, or will you be a shield for at least one of us?" And her proximity did strange things to Cole's heart, like dragging a stubborn horse uphill, and his mouth dried, because self-preservation screamed at him to walk away. But something deeper, something forged in years of solitude and quiet empathy, told him another step would damn his conscience forever. Before he could speak, a deputy burst into the room shouting, "Sheriff, we found her, the Apache girl. They've got her at the rail yard." And Naeli's world dropped out from under her, her posture breaking like a snapped bowstring as she staggered toward the door, whispering, "Lonnie," the name like a prayer and a wound. Holden barked orders, "No one touches her. I'll handle it," then pointed at Cole, "You're coming. You started this mess," and Cole didn't argue, because the thought of that trembling girl being dragged into some wagon cage made bile crawl up his throat. As they rushed into the scorching sunlight, Naeli sprinted ahead of them, her boots pounding dust in the direction of the rail yard, and Cole mounted his horse Diablo and chased, Holden galloping behind, the three of them tearing through crowded streets where townsfolk turned to stare, murmuring scandal as though it were a form of worship, and the bells from the church clanged uselessly against the rising chaos. The rail yard was a maze of smoke, steam, and iron rails gleaming in the sun, and at its edge stood two soldiers holding the girl by her arms, their grips rough, their faces twisted with the arrogant ease of men who felt protected by their uniforms. The girl Lonnie was crying, tears streaking her dusty cheeks, whispering in Apache, "Sister, sister, forgive me," as if she had already been sentenced. And Naeli descended upon them like a hawk upon prey, screaming, "Let her go." and the soldiers jerked back, startled, but one of them barked, "Stand down, tribal woman. She's unregistered and unsponsored. She be relocated to the reservation garrison," and Holden rode in, dismounted, and flashed his badge. "Release her, she's under sheriff protection." But the taller soldier jeered, "Sheriff, territorial law is clear. Any indigenous female without escort or papers is detained," and Naeli's fury blistered through her entire body, and she snarled, "Then escort her to me," and she drove her fist into the soldier's jaw, the crack echoing like a pistol shot. The man staggered, dropping Lonnie, who fell into Cole's arms as he dismounted, and the second soldier reached for his rifle, but Holden slammed him into a freight crate, yelling, "Damn it, stand down. Nobody fires," and for a moment everything froze, the desert wind swirling around them like a living spirit watching judgment unfold. Naeli rushed to Lonnie, cupping her sister's face, murmuring in Apache, soothing the girl's trembling heartbeat, and Lonnie sobbed, "I am sorry. I am weak," and Naeli whispered, "You survived. That is not weakness," before pressing her forehead against hers in a gesture older than the town itself. Cole watched, stunned at the depth of their bond, the fierce tenderness that existed even in a world that had beaten them bloody, and something inside him cracked open like dry earth kissed by rain. The soldiers eventually backed away under Holden's threats, muttering about reporting the incident to the garrison captain, and the sheriff cursed under his breath, "That'll cost me my badge before sunrise," but Naeli looked up at him, grateful and unflinching. "I will remember your bravery," and Holden replied, "Don't. Bravery is just foolishness that hasn't gotten anyone killed yet," and Cole helped Lonnie onto his horse, holding her carefully as though she were made of glass, and she whispered, "Thank you," but Cole shook his head. "Don't thank me yet, we're not safe," and Naeli met his gaze, eyes softer now, shadowed with exhaustion and resolve. "Now you see, safety is an illusion, kindness is a weapon, and both are rarer than water in this land," and Cole nodded, because he finally understood something he had never truly grasped before. His debt to Beckett was nothing, compared to the debt he now owed to himself. If he turned his back on them, he would kill something sacred in his soul, the part of him that had survived war, drought, and loneliness. Holden escorted them through the outskirts of town, where abandoned barns sat like dying animals and the land turned from settlement to wilderness in a few hundred yards, and he said, "You need to get them out of here, soldiers will be looking," and Cole swallowed. "Where?" And Holden pointed west, "Your ranch. It's the one place no one will think to look, not because you're clever, Enders, but because no one believes you've got anything worth hiding," and the sheriff's mouth twisted into a bitter half-smile, and Cole wanted to laugh but could not, because the truth was too sharp. Naeli helped her sister onto Diablo's saddle while Cole held reins, and the girl curled against his chest, shaking like a bird in a cage while Naeli mounted Holden's spare horse, her posture firm, chin lifted, eyes like cold steel, and she murmured, "I will repay this debt with service, not surrender," and Cole rode beside her, glancing sidelong. "You don't owe me anything," and she replied, "Then I give it freely," and he did not argue, because arguing would require admitting he was terrified of what that meant. As they rode out of town, the sky darkened to copper, and the sun dipped, staining the horizon red as spilled blood, and the ranch rose ahead, lonely and stoic, a scattering of fences, a barn built from stubborn hope, and a house that looked more like a prayer than a dwelling, with broken shutters and weather-beaten boards. Yet to Naeli it was shelter more than she had since the day she buried her husband. Cole dismounted and lifted Lonnie gently, carrying her inside, where the air was cool and quiet, dust motes floating like spirits in the last rays of evening light, and Naeli followed, looking around at the modest interior: an iron stove, a rough-hewn table, a single bed, and a rocking chair by the window, and she muttered, almost to herself, "A man who lives alone never thinks of comfort," and Cole paused mid-step, turning to her. "Comfort is expensive," and she countered, "Loneliness is more so," and the words struck him like a hammer. He laid Lonnie in the bed, covering her with a wool blanket, and she fell asleep almost instantly, exhaustion dragging her beneath its waves, and Naeli stood beside the bed, smoothing her sister's hair like a mother, like a guardian. like someone who had chosen to become a shield rather than a sacrifice. And after a long silence, she whispered, "My husband was named Taza. He was a scout, strong and proud. When the soldiers came, he took 6 bullets before falling, and the first held his body until dawn. Then they burned our village, and even the smoke could not hide the smell of death." And Cole listened, heart aching, because every word was a confession carved from bone. She continued, "You think I am strong because I faced Beckett. I am strong because I have already lost everything." And Cole said softly, "Then why risk your life for your sister?" And Naeli looked at him with a glare sharp enough to cut stone. "Because she is all that remains," and he did not know what to say. So he said nothing at all. Outside, coyotes howled in the far distance. Wind rattled loose shingles, and the night arrived like an old friend who had overstayed its welcome, wrapping the ranch in darkness. Cole lit a lantern, its warm glow flickering across the room, and Naeli sat at the table, the firelight catching the copper threads in her braids. And she asked, "Do you still refuse to take me?" And Cole froze, because her tone was not seductive, not pleading. It was tactical, like a strategist asking if a gate would stand when the enemy attacked. He leaned against the wall, hands trembling, and sighed, "I don't take wives. I bury cattle. I repair fences. I sleep alone." And she nodded slowly. "Then I will cook. I will clean. I will guard the girl until you decide differently, or until I find a safer path." And Cole breathed out like a man who had been holding his breath since childhood, and thought to himself that fate had a cruel talent for delivering choices wrapped in blood and mercy. He finally spoke, "Stay for the night," and Naeli's eyes softened. "We will." And she stood, walking toward the rocking chair by the window, sitting with her back straight, hands folded, the posture of someone prepared to keep watch through any darkness. And Cole retreated to the porch, staring out into the starless void of the prairie, wondering if the land itself had conspired to place this widow in his life, or if the universe simply delighted in forcing broken people to hold each other up when the world wanted them on their knees. The sun cut through the horizon like a blade of molten glass when Cole stepped outside the next morning. The prairie painted in swaths of orange, gold, and pale blue, and the air carried that crisp chill of dawn that only existed in places where the land was still, more wild than civilized. Yet something was different now. His ranch was no longer empty, no longer silent, no longer haunted by the simple routine of feeding livestock and convincing himself he was satisfied with a life of solitude. He heard the sound before he saw it, the soft scrape of a chair, the slow rhythm of breathing. And when he turned, he found Naeli sitting in the same rocking chair she had chosen the night before, her eyes half open, spine upright, feet planted, as though she had never once succumbed to sleep. Yet her gaze was alert like a sentry. Lonnie still slept in the bed, curled beneath the wool, her lips moving faintly as if murmuring dreams or prayers. And Cole stepped back inside, clearing his throat awkwardly. "You didn't rest?" he asked, and Naeli finally blinked, letting the light paint her face. "A mother learns to sleep with one ear open. I have no children, but the skill remains," she answered, rising slowly, stretching her arms, the bones of her shoulders cracking like distant thunder. She walked toward the stove, inspected its ash pit and iron plates, and said, "Feed me wood." And Cole, halfway confused, brought her armfuls of timber, which she arranged meticulously as though she were preparing a fire in a tribal lodge rather than a battered white man's kitchen. She lit the flame with flint she carried in a leather pouch at her waist, and it ignited instantly, roaring with a satisfying hunger that seemed almost alive. And Cole watched, marveling not at the fire itself but at the fluidity in her motions, how every gesture was deliberate, practiced, purposeful, as if she were trained not merely to survive the frontier, but to tame it. "Your people use matches," she said without looking at him. "Matches are fickle. Flint is loyal." And Cole laughed softly. "You talk about tools like they're friends." And Naeli stirred the small kettle above the fire. "Dry beans soaking in water left from last night. Everything that keeps you alive is either friend or enemy," she replied simply. And Cole fell silent because he could not argue. An hour later, Lonnie awoke, her dark hair tangled, eyes still glazed with exhaustion, and she clutched the blanket around herself when she noticed Cole at the table. shrinking back like a frightened foal. But Naeli placed a hand on her sister's wrist and whispered in Apache, soft enough to sound like a lullaby. And Lonnie calmed, nodding reluctantly. Cole avoided staring too long, because he remembered how she trembled at the rail yard, how young she was, how easily the world would crush her, and his heart clenched with a mix of guilt, pity, and something that felt dangerously close to protective instinct. Breakfast was silent, just the clink of tin utensils and the crackle of fire, until Naeli spoke abruptly. "We cannot stay hidden for long," and Cole sighed, because he had been dreading that truth. "I know. The soldiers will come," and Naeli nodded. "Beckett Shaw will come first. The man humiliated will always be faster than the law." And she was right. Men like Beckett did not simply forget being disarmed in front of deputies and customers. He would turn his shame into rage, into vengeance, into a crusade to claim what he believed was his by right. And Cole ran a hand through his hair, staring at the door as though Beckett might kick it open any second. "Then what do you suggest?" And Naeli raised her chin. "You must take us beyond the ridge, to the Mescalero path. From there I will find my people." And Cole stiffened. "You can't just walk into Apache territory. Soldiers will think I kidnapped you." And Naeli smirked with a cruel amusement that barely concealed her bitterness. "The soldiers already think you did." And Cole pressed his palms to his eyes, unable to refute the logic that seemed to define this entire situation. Lonnie listened in silence, spoon resting in her hands, her eyes darting between them like a child at a table where elders spoke of war. And finally she whispered, so faint it was almost lost beneath the stove fire, "He saved me." And Naeli looked at her, surprised. "He saved you because he could not bear to watch you sold." And the girl nodded. "Then he must not bear to watch us die." And Cole's lungs folded inward because the words sounded like fate passing sentence. After breakfast, Naeli insisted on helping with chores, and Cole tried to argue, but she silenced him with a stare so fierce it could have cut stone. So he handed her tasks without further complaint. She fixed fence posts with a hammer as though she had done it all her life, lifted water buckets from the well without wincing, gathered eggs from the coop with steady hands, and when she bent over the earth to inspect a dying patch of corn near his barn, she muttered, "So this is why you are drowning." And Cole grimaced, "Drought, disease, poor soil, take your pick." And she knelt, brushing dirt with her fingers. "The land is sick, not dead." And Cole snorted, "Tell that to my ledger." But she continued calmly, "I will show you how to bury fish beneath each stalk. It feeds the soil, traps water, and speaks to the spirits of the earth." And Cole's eyebrows rose. "You talk to dirt." And she smiled faintly. "Do you not talk to your cattle?" And Cole opened his mouth, closed it, and conceded silently. The morning passed in strange harmony, the widow working beside the cowboy as though they had always shared the same world. And from time to time Cole would catch her humming an Apache tune low, mournful, steady like the heartbeat of the desert itself. Lonnie sat on the porch, weaving strands of dried grass into simple braids, occasionally rising to help, timid but determined, as though proving to herself that she was no fragile feather to be blown away by wind. The peace shattered just after noon when dust clouds swirled near the gate and two riders emerged. Not soldiers, not lawmen, but townsfolk with the kind of faces that belonged to men who took orders from Beckett Shaw. The first was wiry, red-bearded, with a shotgun slung across his lap, and the other bulkier, wearing a vest Cole recognized from the copper lantern. They approached without greeting, horses snorting, and the red-bearded man called out, "Anders, you got visitors," voice dripping with smug cruelty. And Cole felt his pulse spike, hand drifting to the revolver holstered at his hip. Naeli stepped beside him, eyes narrowed, hands empty but posture coiled like a drawn bow, while Lonnie retreated behind the porch post, trembling. The men dismounted and swaggered toward the house, and the bulky one grinned. "Boss says you owe him double. Now says you destroyed his property and stole his merchandise." And Cole spat, "I stole nothing." And the wiry man snickered, "Sure you didn't. Only thing is, the sheriff ain't here to back you up anymore." And Cole froze. "What?" And the bulky one shrugged. "He got suspended this morning. Seems the garrison didn't like him interfering." And Cole felt his stomach overturn, because Holden had risked everything to save Lonnie. and his enemies had struck back without hesitation. Naeli's fists tightened at her sides, but she didn't speak, simply watched, calculating. The wiry man continued, "Beckett wants the girls back or wants you in the dirt. Your choice," and Cole said, "Tell him to ride out here himself if he wants blood." And both men laughed, cruel and hollow, and the bulky one grabbed his shotgun, raising it slightly. "Nah, that's what we're for," and time slowed like sap dripping from a tree. Cole drew his revolver instinctively. Naeli lunged forward and snatched a fence rail from the ground, like it weighed nothing, and the next moments were chaos. The bulky man fired but missed, dust exploding near Cole's boots. Cole shot back, striking the man's shoulder and sending him crashing to the ground screaming. The wiry man panicked and raised his gun, but Naeli was already upon him, swinging the fence rail like a warrior's club, the wood smashing into his jaw and neck with a crack so vicious it silenced even the wind. He fell to his knees choking, and she struck him again, this time across the temple, and he collapsed unconscious, blood splashing into the dirt like spilled paint. The ranch fell quiet, except for the wounded man's groaning and the thundering of Cole's pulse in his ears, and Lonnie gasped, hands clamped over her mouth. But Naeli stood still, chest rising and falling, eyes cold, body carved from stone, and she said simply, "They came to collect death and found it," and Cole stared at her, shaken not by the violence, but by how precise and controlled it had been, like she had fought not for rage but for necessity. He holstered his revolver, approached the injured man, kicked away his shotgun, and snarled, "Ride back to Beckett and tell him this ranch is off limits. Tell him if he wants war, he'll get one." And the man whimpered, clutching his bleeding shoulder. But Cole grabbed him by his vest and dragged him to his horse, throwing him into the saddle like a sack of grain, smacking the horse's flank to send it galloping down the dirt road. The unconscious man lay in the dust, and Naeli looked at him without sympathy. "Leave him. The coyotes will take what remains," and Cole shook his head, lifting the body instead, tying him to the fence post with rope. "He'll live long enough to crawl home or be picked up by someone with less hate in their heart." And Naeli tilted her head, studying him. "Mercy is a weakness," she said, but Cole retorted, "No, cruelty is," and they stared at each other, two worlds colliding, neither backing down. The rest of the day passed tense and watchful, as though the entire prairie held its breath, waiting to see who would strike next. Beckett, the soldiers, or fate itself. Cole loaded ammunition, reinforced doors, tightened corral gates, while Naeli sharpened a knife from his tool rack, testing its edge on her arm hair, and Lonnie prepared herbs from a satchel she'd carried since childhood, whispering to the plants as though they were trusted elders. At dusk they ate quietly, three strangers bound by peril, and Cole finally spoke, voice gravelly, "If we stay here much longer, the army will come. When soldiers fight settlers, the settlers win. When soldiers fight tribes, the tribes burn." And Naeli nodded. "Then we leave at dawn," and Lonnie closed her eyes, as though bracing herself for exile once more. Through the thin walls of the ranch, the wind murmured its eternal warning. This land did not tolerate peace for long. As the lantern dimmed, Cole leaned against the doorframe, staring at the fading horizon. The sky bruised with the last remnants of sunlight, and he realized something that frightened him more than Beckett's threats or the army's authority. The longer Naeli stayed, the harder it would be for him to let her go, because she was not merely a refugee or a widow. She was a force that fought against the tide instead of drowning in it, and without meaning to. She had reminded him what it felt like to have something worth defending, something worth risking blood and bone for. Meanwhile, Naeli rocked in the chair, not asleep, not relaxed, simply vigilant, guarding her sister the way a volcano guards fire deep beneath its surface. And she whispered into the night so quietly even the wind might miss it, "We will not bow again." And Cole knew then that chapter of his life had ended. The storm would come, and they would face it together. The evening bled into a new kind of quiet on the ranch, a silence that was not the hush of fear or the shadow of threats, but something tender, fragile, almost human in the way it wrapped around Samuel's bones. And as he stood outside the barn, staring at the horizon where the sun dipped behind the jagged teeth of the mountains, he wondered whether all this Helen's laughter as she taught the two young Apache girls how to tie a lasso Saria's calm voice as she stitched together worn saddlecloths, the sound of boots and moccasins passing through the dust, was real or simply a temporary gift from a universe that rarely spared mercy. Yet there she was, the widow who had once offered herself in place of her sister, as if she were born to survive every cruelty. And he felt the weight of every moment since the day he first saw her. Shoulders firm beneath the morning sun, eyes like burning amber, hands stained with the kind of determination that made weak men ashamed of ever having lifted their heads to complain about their lot in life. And as he watched her now, hair loose, skin carrying the last warmth of daylight, he realized he had never felt so alive nor so uncertain of what it meant to be a man. Still, the ranch demanded its due, and the chores called, and survival in these carved-out western lands was never a thing one could simply dream into being. So he walked back to the barn, brushing past the horses who stamped anxiously, for they too could sense the shifting whines that haunted the desert night. And while he loaded hay, he could hear the faint hum of Saria humming some song from her childhood, a sound that softened even the brittle cracks of wood around him. And it was then that he heard the riders. Their hooves were not the wild chaos of raiders nor the drunken stagger of ranchmen from town. Their rhythm was measured, intentional, a cadence of men who came to speak, to claim, or to take. And Samuel's heart dropped into his boots, every instinct screaming that the fragile harmony they'd built was about to be shattered. So he grabbed for his rifle, hands steady though breath tight, and stepped onto the porch as dusk completed its slow murder of the day. And there they stood, Apache warriors, 8 of them, proud, silent, their hair braided with bone and turquoise, their faces etched with dust and conviction. And at their front sat a tall figure, older, eyes hardened by winters that broke weaker men. And Samuel knew immediately that these were not the same riders who had come before, not the desperate search party that sought a lost woman or a debt of blood. No, these were leaders, clan bearers, the kind whose words could decide who lived and who bled in the dirt beneath them. Saria stepped forward, not with fear but with dignity, and Samuel felt his breath evaporate because she did not tremble nor look away. Instead she spoke in Apache, rapid and fluid, the syllables sharp and cutting yet full of sorrow. And the elder dismounted, his moccasins sinking into sand as he studied her like a man tracing old scars he had hoped would one day fade. And Samuel did not understand the language, but he understood the tone. It was accusation. It was grief. It was the sound of a people betrayed by time, land, and the cruelty of white men. And he felt shame coil around his heart, because though he had never struck the Apache, he was still one more settler perched on stolen land, one more survivor of a war he never fought, one more outsider who benefited from the bones of the earth they once called home. The elder spoke again, voice low and commanding, and Saria answered in a trembling burst that made Samuel tense. And then she told him, voice breaking, that they had come for her because she was promised to another before. The wars took everything, because she had been a wife once, and a widow twice, and her tribe believed the third was a fate no woman should endure. And Samuel's stomach twisted, because they meant to take her from him, from the ranch, from the tender rhythm she had built with her sister and the other women, as if she were a wandering piece of land that could be claimed by whichever hands reached first. And he found himself stepping forward, not thinking, simply moving between her and them, rifle lowered but ready. And he said words that surprised even him, that she was free, that she would not be forced, that she had chosen this life, chosen these sun-baked fields, chosen the work and the sweat and the promise of growing something rather than simply surviving. And the elder laughed, not cruelly but with the weight of a man who had seen many young fools believe themselves strong before the canyon swallowed their bones. And he told Samuel in broken English that and does not choose settlers. Women do not choose their husbands without consequence, and warriors do not forget the promises made when their blood still steamed fresh upon the desert sand. Samuel's jaw clenched, his palms slick with fear, for though he was a capable rancher, he was not a killer, not a man designed for war. And yet he knew that if they tried to take her, his blood would stain the land rather than let her go. And before he could speak again, Saria placed a hand on his arm, firm, grounding, a woman's touch made not of submission but of protection. And she stepped forward, chin lifted, declaring that she was not a prize nor a burden that could be traded like a horse, that she had offered herself, once out of desperation, to save her sister, but she would not be dragged back to a future built on old traditions that did not understand the woman she had become. The younger warriors murmured, hands gripping their spears, but the elder listened, expression unreadable. And then he asked her a question in Apache, so soft it seemed to drift through the air like smoke, and Saria trembled before answering. The words slow, reverent, almost prayer-like, and Samuel did not need to understand the language to know she was speaking of her husband, the one who had died, of the child who never lived, of the women taken, of the nights she slept beneath the hard sky with only the moon to witness her tears. And he felt something tighten in his throat, because Saria's pain was not something she wielded as a weapon, it was something she carried like a shield, a reminder that she had known worse than men with rifles and the cold hands of winter, that she had climbed out of the ashes of everything she loved. When she finished speaking, the elder turned to the youngest among them, a boy hardly more than 16, and gestured, and the youth stepped forward holding something Samuel could not see until the moonlight kissed it, a blackened pendant carved from horn, engraved with the symbol of her clan, the emblem of the lineage she had been born to continue. And Saria gasped, knees buckling as she recognized it, because it belonged to her husband, the one who died, the one whose bones lay somewhere far away, buried by men who could not speak his name. The elder placed the pendant into her palm and spoke of the last battle, of how her husband had fought not for glory, nor for some dream of victory, but to buy the women time to escape, and that they had found him alive for only a moment, long enough for him to tell them one thing, that Saria should live, not mourn, not bind herself to a stranger out of duty, not fade into the quiet death of tradition, but rise as the woman she was meant to be. And at that, Saria broke, her tears not those of weakness but of release, and the warriors lowered their eyes in respect, and the elder finally looked at Samuel, voice no longer sharp but resigned, saying the widow had chosen, and that a man who lived with such a woman should learn what it meant to share the earth rather than own it. The tension dissolved like frost under sunlight, and the riders mounted their horses, turning back toward the distant mesas, leaving Saria clutching the pendant to her heart. And when the last drumbeat of hoofprints vanished into darkness, she fell against Samuel, sobbing into his shirt, and he wrapped his arms around her trembling frame, not as a conqueror, not as a rescuer, but as a man who understood that love in this land was not a possession. It was a vow born of storms, forged in fire and blood, and carried forward by those who still dared to sow seeds into unforgiving soil. Later, as stars scattered across the heavens like sparks from a dying campfire, Helen lit the lamps in the house and whispered that it felt like they were finally safe. But Samuel knew the West never gave safety, it offered only chances. Some paid for in tears, some in life, some in the stolen breaths of those who never saw dawn again. And yet, as Saria slept that night in his arms, fingers still curled around the pendant of her past, he made a silent promise to the desert, to the wind, to the dead who watched from beyond the mesas, that he would protect her not because she was fragile, not because she was a lost widow, but because she had chosen him, and any man worth the dust beneath his boots would honor the choice of a woman who had survived everything the world could throw at her. And as the embers of the morning sun began to form at the edge of the horizon, the ranch stirred awake once more, but this time with the sense that a new battle had been fought and won, not with weapons, not with bloodshed, but with truth, respect, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the greatest wars in the West were waged not between rival tribes or greedy settlers, but inside the hearts of those who dared to love. If you want more legends like this, subscribe to the Heartland Diaries and join a growing campfire of believers in courage and destiny. Click like, share, and hit the bell. The West rides on.